At the top of the staircase, she paused before the door. Was he there, on the other side, waiting for her? She turned the handle and pushed it open, holding the plank over her shoulder, ready to strike. He wasn't there. She entered the room, looking left and right. And she saw him. He was lying a short distance from the bottom of the central staircase, a trail of blood glistening behind him. He held his neck with one red hand. In the other hand, which trembled as he reached out towards her, he held his gun. His face, despite everything, remained blank. She figured he would be able to get off one shot before she reached him. She walked towards him, remembering all the times he had raped her, the way he had chained her to the bed, treated her like a dog, a sow, a slave. She recalled the pain and the loneliness and how it had felt when little Luca was taken away. When she was halfway across the hall, he squeezed the trigger with his last ounce of strength and dropped the gun, and it was as if the bullet passed straight through her, a miracle. She heard the voices of the other women rise into a chorus, for us, as she reached him and raised the thick strip of wood. After he was dead, after she'd smashed his skull and his face was no longer recognizable, a pulp of blood and bone, she dropped the plank and turned to see the bullet hole in the wall. It was no miracle. He was a bad shot. That was all. Alina didn't remember much about the next week, about her journey through the forest, about breaking into houses and stealing food and money, checking the internet in an empty cafe and finding out where she had to go. She barely recalled hitching rides with men who thought they might stand a chance with her until she gave them the look that made them go pale. The days when she hid and the nights when she traveled merged into one, and she began to see her life like a graphic novel in which she was a dark figure who drifted across the panels, no speech bubbles, crossing a series of borders, Ukraine, Poland, Germany, where she paid a truck driver to take her with him to France. He was small and silent and had yellow teeth like a rat. He told her she reminded him of his daughter, who had gone missing when she was 19, a dozen years ago. He had never given up hope, he said. One day, he was sure, he would receive a letter or a phone call, just to let him know she was okay. Alina listened, thinking the girl was probably dead, had most likely been murdered, probably by this man beside her, and as she thought this she felt another spirit join her band. So there were 13 of them now, following her across Europe. In France, the man with the rat's teeth dropped her off and gave her €100 which she spent on a ticket to Calais. There she boarded a ferry which crossed the English Channel on a freezing February night. She stood on the deck and watched the dark coastline approaching. She was calm. The sea churned beneath the ferry and she decided that when this was over this would be a good place to end it. After she'd cleaned up, another line of poetry came to her. All angels are terrifying. She smiled to herself. Oh yes, she thought. And I am the most terrifying of all, the angel of vengeance. I am Morella, she whispered, and around her the 13 dead women whispered amen back. Part 6. London, November 2013, Chapter 50. It was fully dark by the time we pulled up outside Aaron and Rob's house. I was still reeling from what Edward had said. Alina was alive. The shot we'd heard from inside the house hadn't killed her. Did that mean the baby was alive too? And the women who'd been tied to the beds in the upstairs room, who had haunted my nightmares for months, what about them? I badly wanted to know, because I needed some good to cling to among the chaos, the revelations that had come thick and fast since I'd hired Edward. Chief among these was the shock of working out, assuming I was correct, that Camelia and her partner in crime were looking for drugs. I explained my thinking in the car on the way to see Laura. The dog, brought to sniff out drugs. All the questions about doing something illegal. It's got to be drugs. Edward agreed it made sense. So the person with Camelia on your video. Could it be Alina? I shook my head. It was definitely a man. So I think, if Alina's actually alive, and here, then it must be Ion. The guy in the video is the right height and build. And the three of them are in together. It felt as if the fog was clearing around me, our words cutting through it. But lots of questions remained. Why wait so long to come for the drugs? Because Alina was trapped in that house. I still could hardly believe she was alive. How did she get out? Edward swung the car hard around a corner. We'll be able to ask her soon. Darkness glinted in his eyes. This Ion seems like the most likely candidate for firebombing my office. Trying to stop you from talking to me. It must have been him at Camden Lock watching Laura. And I bet he pushed Jake off that bridge. Anger burst inside me and I thumped the dashboard. That fucker. Him and Alina. We trusted them. There are still parts that don't make sense. Edward swung around another corner. We were close to our destination now. My guess is that Camellia was their contact in London who was going to retrieve the drugs when you got back. I think they must have taken your passports so you would have to fly home straight away to get new ones, bringing the drugs with you. But then something went wrong, you and Laura got kicked off the train, along with Alina. Unless the whole thing with the house was part of the setup, but I can't for the life of me work out how that could be the case. Also, I can't figure out this whole thing with Alina and Laura, Edward continued. She showed herself to Laura, made contact with her. Do you think Laura knows that Alina is real? Or does she really think she's a ghost? The question irritated me and I felt a surge of protectiveness towards Laura. She definitely thinks Alina is a ghost. Listen, Laura is not stupid. But she's been through an awful lot. She's extremely vulnerable. Edward nodded. We need to talk to them, but my guess is that Alina was following Laura, spying on her, trying to find out if she had the drugs, and Laura saw her. And, believing Alina was dead, and having a track record when it comes to this sort of thing, I finished the sentence. Laura assumes that she's being visited by Alina's spirit. I prayed that Alina was still at the house. Then, finally, we would get all the answers. We turned into the road where Aaron and Rob lived. Oh shit, Edward sighed. I looked up, following his gaze as we pulled up to the curb. There was a police car parked outside Aaron and Rob's house. My mouth went dry. What now? I tore off my seat belt and jumped out of the car, ran towards the house and began banging on the door. Rob opened it almost immediately, a look of hope on his face that vanished when he saw me. He held a photo of baby Oscar in his hand. Behind him, in the hallway, Aaron stood with two uniformed police officers. She was crying. What is it? I asked. What's happened? Rob swallowed before he spoke. It's Oscar, he said. We can't find him. Chapter 51. I tried to imagine what Aaron and Rob must be feeling. I couldn't. Panic, terror, desperation. They were only words. The look on Aaron's face told the whole story. She came over to the door. She held a small pink comforter, with the head of a teddy bear, which she gripped so hard her knuckles were white. She had dark circles around her eyes, as did Rob, and her hair stuck up at 100 different angles. She wore a loose top with what I realized were milk stains on the front. Has she been in touch with you? She demanded. Do you know where she is? You mean Laura? Yes. She spat the name through clenched teeth. Who else? She's taken my baby. That bitch has stolen my fucking baby. One of the police officers, a black woman with a round, kind face, stepped forward, laying a hand on Aaron's shoulder. We don't know that Miss Mackenzie has done anything criminal. Aaron turned on her, the comforter trembling in her hand. Nothing criminal. She was meant to be watching Oscar while Rob and I grabbed an hour's sleep. I knew we shouldn't have done it, should have taken him into bed with us. Her voice cracked. But I'm so tired. So tired. I thought it would be okay for an hour. Rob tried to put an arm around his wife but she shrugged it off. What was I thinking, trusting that crazy bitch with my baby? She tried to kill herself last week. She talks to ghosts. She's insane. Ghosts. The policewoman said, confused. Yes, she. Alina's not a ghost. Everyone turned to look at Edward, who had appeared in the doorway. He introduced himself. I think you'd better come in, said the policewoman. I'm PC Elaine Davies. She also introduced the male police officer, who nodded at us as Edward shuffled into the hallway and closed the front door behind him. An expensive-looking black pram sat beneath the coats that hung on the wall. Rob glanced at it then looked away like it stung his eyes. "You're Laura Mackenzie's boyfriend, is that right?" Davies asked me, leading Edward and me out of the crowded hallway into the living room, while the other cop took the two stricken parents into the kitchen. I heard him say something about putting the kettle on in a falsely bright voice. The living room was messy, with muslin squares screwed up on the floor, teddy bears and cuddly rabbits lying around, DVDs spilling out of box sets. The room had a musty, sweet smell, a faint trace of baby poo. Yes. Well, ex-boyfriend. We came here to see her. Single quote. I trailed off. What happened? As she said, Mr. and Mrs. Tranham asked Laura to keep an eye on Oscar so they could grab an hour's sleep. Oscar was asleep in his cot in the nursery upstairs. Do you have children yourself, Mr.? Single quote. Sullivan. No, I don't. I remember when my daughter was a newborn. All you think about is sleep. It becomes a kind of obsession. When she woke up, Mrs. Tranham looked at the clock and saw that 2 hours had passed. She had asked Laura to wake her after an hour but assumed Laura was trying to be kind. She went into the nursery. Oscar wasn't there. He wasn't anywhere. And neither was Miss Mackenzie. She's probably just taken him out for a walk, I said, not really believing it. She didn't take the pram, Edward Said, and PC Davies nodded. That's right. And Mrs. Tranham has a baby sling too, but that's hanging up in the nursery. As far as the Tranhams can tell, Laura hasn't taken anything with her. The bag they used to transport nappies in is still here. Mrs. Tranham says that they had just used the last nappy from the packet and the new one hasn't been opened. And you saw the comforter. That was left in the cot. Have you tried ringing her? I didn't blame PC Davies for the look she gave me. It's going straight to voicemail, immediately, like it's off. So you've had no contact from her. Edward spoke as I shook my head. I saw her a little earlier. That was at 4:30. 2.5 hours ago. Where was she? Standing in the garden. She was talking to a young woman called Alina, a Romanian woman. Davies had her notepad out now. Alina. Do you have a surname? No. Sorry. And what's her relationship to Miss Mackenzie? I looked to Edward for help. He shrugged. It's complicated. All right. Let's come back to that. You said something about a ghost. Yes. Laura has a history of imagining spirits. When she told Daniel that she'd seen Alina, he assumed that she was seeing another ghost. We believe Laura thought she was a ghost too. But she's very much alive. I saw her. The policewoman looked at both of us in turn, trying to work out if we were winding her up. So Laura Mackenzie has mental health issues. No. I mean, she has been acting strangely recently. But she's not crazy. And she would never harm a baby. Or allow it to be harmed. The policewoman asked. She drove Aaron to the hospital, was there at the birth. Aaron's her best friend. She would never allow anything to happen to her baby. Davies made more notes in her pad. I saw that she had written the words, mental health, and wished I hadn't said anything about ghosts. So, the policewoman began. This Alina was here at 4:30 as well. Edward nodded. That's right. In the garden. Let's take a look, shall we? To reach the garden we had to go through the kitchen. Rob was in there with the male PC, holding a mug of tea close to his lips, not drinking it. I could hear something buzzing from upstairs. Aaron had to go and express some milk, Rob explained. She should be feeding Oscar right now. Davies made a sympathetic face. We're going to find him, Mr. Tranham. I promise you. He was clearly desperate to believe her. We need to take a look in your garden. Rob unlocked the back door and led us outside. It was dark, but the police officers had torches which they switched on, the twin beams crossing halfway down the lawn. We hardly come out here in the winter, Rob said, as if he was apologizing for the overgrown lawn, the mulchy leaves that swamped the flower beds. They were standing right here, Edward sighed, indicating a spot parallel to the side gate. Laura was here, facing into the garden, while Alina was here, looking towards the house. Alina asked Rob. Who the hell's that? When did you see them? Could you hear what they were talking about? Davies asked, addressing Edward but placing a hand on Rob's arm. No. Laura doesn't know me, so I thought it was better to fetch Daniel, to get him to talk to her, confront her with the truth that Alina is real. Davies tutted loudly, then walked off across the lawn towards the end of the garden, sweeping her torch beam left and right. I wasn't sure what she was looking for. Some evidence that Laura had brought Oscar out here. Edward and I tried to follow her, but she told us to stay back. Who the hell is this Alina woman? Rob pressed us. What is going on? When I assured him it was all too much to go into now, pleaded with him to be patient a few minutes longer, he surprised me by acquiescing. I think he'd reached overload for the moment. He slumped against the house, chewing his fingernails. Near the back wall was a little copse of apple trees and a shed where the lawnmower and gardening tools were stored. We could see Davies's torch flitting about in the darkness. There was a creak and a bang, which I assumed was the policewoman yanking the shed door open. Mr. Tranham, she called a moment later. Rob walked past us towards her voice and Edward and I followed. When we reached the shed, Davies said, "When was the last time you looked in here?" "I don't know. I think I cleared it out just before Christmas. Do you recognize these items?" She shone the torch into the dark interior of the shed. I peered in, standing just behind Rob. There was a sleeping bag stretched out on the floor, and crisp packets and chocolate wrappers were scattered around it, along with several empty water bottles. Rob's mouth dropped open. No. Well, the sleeping bag is ours, but it's usually hanging there, wrapped in its bag, next to the other one. He pointed. The rubbish. That definitely wasn't here before. Oh my god. Looks like someone's been living in your shed. Alina, I said. I guessed that she usually put the sleeping bag away during the day and took away the rubbish. Davies rubbed her chin. This kind of thing happens quite a lot. We often get calls from people saying they've found a homeless person squatting in their shed. Won't anyone tell me who the fuck Alina is? Asked Rob, looking at me, his fists clenching and unclenching like he was going to grab hold of me. Is that who's taken Oscar? In a moment, Mr. Tranham, Davies said. Come on, let's go. Back to the house. Mr. Sullivan, I need a full description of this Alina. She took her radio out and called in as we walked back towards the house, relaying my description of the Romanian woman we had left for dead in that house. When we reached the kitchen, Erin had reappeared. She held a bottle of breast milk. Rob took it from her gently and put it in the fridge while Erin stared into space, seemingly lost. Capable, calm Erin was paralyzed. She stared at her phone, as if it would give her the answer she so desperately needed. Where was her baby? There's another person we need to tell you about, Edward Said. Alina's boyfriend. His name is Ion. There's a third party too, called Camellia. Edward went on to tell the police officers about how he believed it was Ion who had thrown a Molotov cocktail into his office. He told them the bare, essential facts about everything else too. How Laura and I had met Alina and Ion. How we believed the Romanians had come looking for us, and why. I was glad he didn't mention the house in the forest because as he talked Davies looked more and more like a woman who was paddling out of her depth, while Erin and Rob stared at us incredulously. Davies scribbled notes in her pad. I explained about the break-ins, the dog attack, how I'd reported most of it to the police already. I was going to mention Jake too but could see that this could be a distraction. The important thing, I said, is that they think Laura is either holding or knows the whereabouts of the drugs they planted in our luggage. I bet they've got Laura and Oscar locked up somewhere now, and that they're threatening to harm the baby if Laura doesn't tell them what they want to know. Harm the baby. Aaron shrieked at me and I flushed with shame. I'm sorry, I don't mean. Single quote. Rob was looking at me like he wanted to kill me. Like it was me who had taken his baby. They haven't done anything violent so far. Apart from set a dog on you and chuck a fucking Molotov cocktail into this guy's office. Rob's face was purple with anger, a vein throbbing in his forehead. Mate, calm down. Don't fucking call me mate. I'm certain Oscar will be fine, I said, turning to Erin. She sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands, sobbing. Rob pointed a finger at me. This is your fault, you and Laura. We knew something freaky had happened to you in Romania and now we know what. You got mixed up with drug dealers. And you brought them here. You put my family in danger. His face twisted in fury as he jabbed his finger into my chest. Why didn't you warn us? If anything happens. Single quote. There was nothing I could say. No way I could defend myself. Davies stepped between us. This isn't helping. Mr. Tranham, I need you to stay calm. Rob tried to get round Davies, to get to me, and the male police officer grabbed hold of Rob's arm, holding him back. Come on, sir. Rob shot me a look of contempt. Where are they? These drug dealers. If you don't help us find them, if anything happens to Oscar, I'm going to kill you. And he started to cry, his chest heaving as Erin pulled him towards her and they embraced. I stared at them, trying to imagine their pain, knowing that this was worse than anything I'd been through. And in that moment I vowed to help them. I was going to find Laura and Oscar. I was going to end this. Chapter 52. Davies asked me to give her full descriptions of Alina, Ion and Camellia. She left the room to make a phone call, and returned a few minutes later with an update. Okay. Photos of Laura and Oscar are going straight into circulation along with descriptions of the 3 Romanians Mr. Sullivan told us about. Erin made a whimpering sound. We don't know, Davies went on, that this trio have anything to do with it. There's still a very strong chance that Miss Mackenzie has taken Oscar out for a walk and will come back through that door at any moment, wondering what all the fuss is about. At which point, I'll throttle her, Rob said. We all knew that Laura hadn't simply taken the baby out for a stroll. Davies took a deep breath. We've got more specialist officers on their way here now, she said. Specialists in what? Rob asked. Child abduction. Davies nodded hesitantly. Right on cue, the doorbell rang. Rob rushed to answer it, and when he returned to the kitchen he had a man and woman with him, both wearing suits. The man was in his 50s, with 5 o'clock shadow and baggy eyes. The woman was British Asian, with sharp eyes that flicked across each of us in turn before resting on Edward. She nodded and I realized they knew each other. Well. Fancy seeing you here, the male detective said. You wait all year for a case involving Edward Rooney, and then 2 come along at once. They introduced themselves to the rest of us as Detective Inspector Rita Dacey and Detective Sergeant Simon Farrow. Davies took them into the living room to brief them. You're in good hands, Edward sighed to Erin and Rob. My work brings me into contact with the police quite a lot, and Dacey is one of the good ones. After 5 minutes that felt much longer, the detectives returned. Davies loitering behind them. This is quite a tale you've told, Dacey said, looking at Edward then me. I suspect there are a lot of missing details, though. Am I right? Edward met Dacey's eye. I promise you, detective, we've told you everything you need to know. You should let us judge that. It will take too long to explain it all, I blurted. We shouldn't be standing around here chatting, we need to be out there, looking for them. It's got to be the Romanians. Once we find them, we'll find Oscar. Davies took Rob and Erin back into the kitchen, leaving Edward and me with the 2 detectives. Have you checked with immigration? Edward asked. We think Ion and Camellia only entered the country recently. We're checking it now, Dacey said. It would help if you knew their surnames. What about the Romanian community in London? Edward asked. Have you got officers talking to community leaders? Going round the Romanian bars and cafes? Please stop trying to tell us how to do our jobs. I'm just saying what I was planning to do next. Daisy pursed her lips, and I wondered if she and Edward had a history. I couldn't stand still. I wanted to be out there now, doing what Edward had suggested, racing around the places frequented by Romanians, describing Alina, Ion and Camelia. I pulled Edward aside and spoke in a low voice. Let's go. We're not doing any good waiting here. We'll drive around. You can take me to all these places you were planning to visit. We might find someone who knows something before the police do. He looked over at the detectives. Desi's phone rang and she turned away to take the call, wandering into the hallway. Pharaoh had gone into the garden to look at the place where Alina had been sleeping. Come on then. We slipped out the front door and walked over to the car. This was better than being stuck in that house with Aaron and Rob crawling the walls with anxiety, waiting around for the detectives to do something. You really shouldn't blame yourself, Edward sighed. You didn't invite this chaos into your life. It found you. I didn't reply. I'm going to look up Romanian restaurants, I said. As I tapped words into Google on my phone, Edward nudged me and I looked up. We watched as Daisy and Pharaoh hurried out of the house to their car and, without hesitation, sped away, tires screeching. Something's happened, Edward sighed, and my stomach lurched. Let's find out what. I closed my eyes and prayed that they hadn't found a body, or maybe two, and all I could see was that tiny coffin in the house in the forest. Edward pulled out into the traffic and began to follow the detective's car. Chapter 53. The detectives attached their blues and twos to the top of their car, the blue light flashing, siren wailing, and we followed in their wake as the heavy traffic pulled aside. Darkness clawed at the windows as we got stuck in an underpass before finally emerging onto the A12, which would give us a relatively clear run east. I gripped the seat, staring out at the flickering city lights, flinching as a taxi cut across lanes between us and the detective's car. Edward hit the brake, the car shuddered. Arsehole, Edward breathed, shifting gears. Do you know this area? I asked. Not well. I had a client whose husband was cheating on her with a woman who lived near Valentine's Park. It looks like we're heading in that direction. Please, I prayed silently. Please let Laura and Oscar be there. It wasn't until after we'd pulled off the main road into a series of side streets that we lost the detective's car. Edward swore, turning from one small, cramped road into another. Many of the houses had large satellite dishes for picking up foreign TV channels, others displayed England flags. We reached a dead end and Edward backed up, tried another street. There, I said excitedly, pointing at two marked police cars parked outside a little house, along with the detective's gray Passat. A small crowd had come out of their houses to watch. I jumped out as soon as Edward squeezed into a parking space and ran up to the front door. I banged on the door and a uniformed officer opened it. Are they here? I blurted. The female police officer's face was a worrying gray color, like she'd just seen something sickening. She said, "Sir, this is a crime scene, please step away from the house." Edward reached us just as Daisy came to the front door. She looked just as ill as the first woman. Sick with fear and desperate to see inside, I tried to push past them but the two women blocked my path. You can't come in here, Daisy said. What's going on? Edward asked. We saw you run out of Aaron and Rob's house. Single quote. And decided to follow. Typical. We got a call. A neighbor reported someone crying for help, broke in and called the police. There was a ball of ice in the pit of my stomach. Is the baby here? Laura. Daisy stepped past the policewoman onto the overgrown front path. She rubbed her face. No, they're not here. But Ion is. And a woman. She sucked in freezing air and exhaled, her breath clouding the space between them. Ion has taken a hell of a beating but he's still alive. But the woman is dead. Beaten to death. I gawped at her. Please, God, no. What does the other woman look like? Edward asked, red and black. Hair. Punky looking. No. Nothing like that. I couldn't hold back. I ducked past Daisy and ran into the house past the policewoman, whose back was turned. Daisy shouted, "Hey!" And I could hear her chasing me into the squat, but I was faster. I heard voices coming from a room up ahead and ran through the door, not caring that I was contaminating a crime scene. The police had their backs to me, looking at the body of the woman on the floor. I couldn't see her face and, in the shadows, it was impossible to see if her hair was blonde like Camilla's or strawberry blonde like Laura's. I crept closer, holding my breath. It was Camellia. I gasped, and one of the police officers turned around and shouted at me. Daisy arrived, grabbed my arm and helped another officer drag me out of the house. She pushed me onto the lawn. "You fucking idiot," she barked at me. I needed to see, to check it wasn't Laura. I turned to Edward. It was Camellia. Daisy threw up her arms in exasperation, then went back into the house, but not before snarling, "Keep out." Edward put an arm around my shoulders and led me out of the garden to the pavement. At the same time, more police arrived and began to string up crime scene tape across the entrance to the house. Two officers urged the growing crowd to keep back. Children ran about in the road, excited by the action, while their parents strained to see what was going on. Edward led me across the road, away from the mob. I could hear a siren wailing, growing louder. An ambulance pulled up across the road. The siren cut out, and two paramedics got out and jogged into the house. Before long, they came back out and went in again, carrying a stretcher. "Come on," Edward sighed, leading Daniel to the rear of the ambulance. After a few moments, the paramedics came back out of the house, bearing the stretcher with Ion on it. Detective Daisy walked just behind them. Ion lay with his face towards us, eyes closed. Seeing him again sent a shudder through me, and I put my hand on the ambulance to steady myself. Members of the crowd had raised their phones and were filming the scene. A woman shouted something about foreigners and filthy squatters. As the stretcher reached the back of the ambulance, Ion opened his eyes and looked straight at me. He smiled. "Hello, Daniel," he said. The paramedics began to lift the stretcher, but Daisy held up an arm. "Wait. We need to get this man to hospital now," one attendant said. "Just a moment." Ion continued to stare at me, the faint smile still on his lips. He winced with pain as he forced out a few words. "I just wanted to make a little money. I wanted to grab hold of him, to hurt him for what he'd done. What he'd put us through. For what we were still going through." Edward saw the anger on my face and held me back. "Nothing personal." Ion squeezed his eyes shut. "Where's Alina?" Edward asked. Ion opened his eyes again, still looking at me. "Alina." He tried to laugh, the act sending a new spasm of pain through him. The paramedics rocked from foot to foot, tried to move the stretcher, but Daisy urged them to wait a moment. "Yes. Where is she? Please tell us." "I wish I knew," he said.